Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast, which today is going to focus on the Chancellor Rachel Reeves' statement to the House of Commons, the update on the public finances, as well as some substantive announcements which were made in terms of welfare spending, which are likely to lead to a political backlash within the Parliamentary Labour Party when Parliament comes to vote for this. And staying with the financial theme, is fiscal autonomy? No, that's not an Irish dancer, by the way. Is fiscal autonomy the way to go for Scotland? The SNP government think yes. We'll perhaps look at the pros and cons of that particular issue. But first of all, good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Barnett.
And let's sort of chew over the statement. I'll maybe go into the details of the statement in a moment, but give me your initial first impressions of it.
Well, I mean, it's like that old Irish joke, isn't it? If you're asking for the directions on for how to get to Limerick or something, well, sir, I wouldn't start from here, because that is, the situation in which Rachel Reeves and indeed Keir Starmer finds themselves. The pursuit of economic growth is all, but the Office of Budget Responsibility, and we might have a word about the OBR as well and its role in politics. The OBR has downgraded projections for economic growth yet again. Growth is now projected to be just 1% of GDP this year. The fiscal environment is immensely challenging. The government is sort of in a maze, I think, from which many of the exits have been blocked up. Now, the government themselves blocked some of them up with their pre-election promises not to increase rates of income tax, national insurance for employees, VAT. So that has reduced a certain amount of options that might otherwise have been available. But other sort of constraints have been imposed by the electorate, by the financial markets, by the international situation. And so we're in a situation where, after much jiggery-pokery, Rachel Reeves has the same amount of fiscal headroom, margin for error or room for manoeuvre now after the spring statement as she did after her budget in October. That's roughly about £10 billion, which is almost nothing in a £1 trillion budget. It means that she is still hostage to events, I would suggest. And I think you already have a sense that this spring statement is a kind of holding initiative. You have think tanks and analysts suggesting that come the budget in October, it is more likely than not that taxes, which are already high by historic standards, I think they're projected to reach almost 38% of GDP this year, or towards the end of this parliament anyway. But the likelihood is that taxes will have to go up in the autumn to pay for existing commitments, to say nothing of the cost of future unexpected events and developments.
Yeah, and we've, I think, both agreed that there is absolutely no way that the commitments that Labour made to the public at the general election in their manifesto will see the end of this parliament. And in fact, the coach and horses, the proverbial coach and horses, may well be driven through that manifesto as early as October. But of course, growth, and more growth is essentially the mantra of this government. What are the OBR saying in terms of growth? Well, this year, 2025, they've cut the growth forecast from 2% to 1%. They're saying that the economy will grow by 1.9% in 2026, 1.8% in 2027, 1.8% in 2029. Now, these are already very, very modest elements of growth. If one looks at the history of OBR forecasts and ones which are at the outer side, it may well be that those figures are overly generous. However you add it up, whether they're at the generous end of the spectrum or not, they are not the kind of growth figures that are going to allow Labour to do substantive things. The OBR also said that the Chancellor was overestimating the savings which would be made from welfare. She'd said £5 billion just a matter of weeks ago. They say £3.4 billion. As a consequence of that, the Chancellor has announced further reforms, which amount to even more cuts to the welfare budget. The health element of universal credit has been cut by 50%. That's an actual cut for people who are in receipt of that. And the health element of universal credit will be frozen for new claimants. As a consequence of this, and here is where the politics get absolutely horrible for Labour, absolutely horrible. 800,000 people will now not receive the daily living component of the personal independent payment. And as a consequence of that, 250,000 people, including 58,000 children, are going to be pushed into poverty. And Labour's opponents are going to hang that around the neck of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And of course, in terms of increased expenditure, the government this week confirmed that defence spending will hit 2.5% of GDP by 2027. That's an extra 2.2 billion extra for defence next year. And one of the key headlines from this statement, which was leaked by the Chancellor herself in a series of interviews at the weekend, the 15% reduction in civil service jobs. So let's maybe tease this out a bit, Alec. We'll deal with the growth issue, then we'll deal with the welfare issue, and then we'll deal with this issue of the reduction in headcount in civil service jobs, because that will put them on a collision course with public sector trade unions. And indeed, although they've launched a voluntary redundancy scheme, given the sheer numbers that are involved in this, it's unlikely, probably unlikely, that they will get them through voluntary redundancy. So starting and honing in on the growth forecasts, I mean, even if the OBR are right, and they're not always right.
Well, they're usually wrong.
They're usually wrong, in fact. Given that we're talking maximum 1.9% growth in 2026, this suggests that Labour are fighting a losing war when it comes to actually having the amounts of money that they need in order to turn public services around.
Yes. I mean, it's very curious. I mean, the budget last October was an expansionary budget. It announced public spending that was a £70 billion increase on where the Conservative plans would have had public spending. It included £40 billion more of taxation, mostly levelled on businesses. And it increased borrowing as well. And yet, somehow or other, Labour have lost control of the message. And so you have an awful lot of people, voters and indeed parliamentarians as well, suggesting that Labour are bringing back austerity. Whereas the Institute of Fiscal Studies has confirmed that isn't actually the case. Public spending is going to increase throughout this parliament. At the same time, however, once you protect state pensions, once you protect the NHS, once you protect or sharply increase defence spending, then at an individual departmental level, then many budgets are going to be tight. That's certainly the case. And the rate of increase in welfare spending is being slowed. Total amount of welfare spending is still going to increase over the course of this parliament, but the rate of that increase is slower. But this is a political, if you like, a political argument that Labour is losing at present. I think, and that reflects the frustration that's felt within the electorate as a whole, a degree of fatalism as well, a sense that nothing is really working quite the way it ought to. And the growth problem is that it's quite difficult for governments to magically create growth. But they can help set the conditions in which growth is more likely. The problem for Labour is that they have this recognition that economic growth is the only way that the sums can be made to add up, actually. At the same time, however, they have policy initiatives that, however respectable they may be in isolation, so I'm talking about things like the increase to employers' national insurance, the forthcoming workers' rights bill, which, however well-intentioned, as I say, however much you might approve of the individual measures in it in terms of banning 0 hours contracts, making it impossible to get rid of workers on day one of their jobs and so on. Collectively, these measures make it harder and for businesses to employ people, frankly. And since increasing the rate of economic activity, reducing the number of inactive people is also a core government ambition, you see these ambitions essentially working against one another. And so I think you have a Labour government that in one sense is riding two horses. And those horses, eventually diverge and take different paths. And so at some point you have to make a choice. So I think it's really difficult for them on the growth side of it. At the same time, a degree of caution I think is reasonable with regard to the Office of Budget Responsibility. Its forecasts are the best we have, but they are not, infallible. And there is a difficulty with the OBR in as much as it is very good at analysing the cost of government initiatives, but very bad at projecting what benefits might arise from government policies. And so one of the interesting things in the OBR's report is that for the first time, they've applied what's known as dynamic scoring to a part of the government's agenda, which is Angela Rayner's plans for planning reform, unlocking house building. The OBR suggests that actually Labour might get close to the 1.5 million extra houses in England that they have promised, and that this will have a small but welcome and measurable and definite positive impact on economic growth. What the OBR has not done, however, is expand that dynamic scoring to other areas of government policy. So, the incentives for getting people off welfare and back into work have not been scored in that way. And this is a long-standing complaint that people have had about the OBR. Conservative governments had made the same complaint, and Labour are now also finding that the OBR sets the rules in certain respects. And it is somewhat remarkable in many ways, I think, that we are now in a situation where the government is essentially constrained by the Office of Budget Responsibility, which, for all its merits and virtues and so on, is not a democratically elected or accountable body. And I think that constraint is something that is going to become harder and harder to maintain in the years to come. But I don't know. I mean, what's your view on this
Well,
one?
I think it was interesting that the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who I think are even more pessimistic than the OBR, believe that the Chancellor will have no option but to visit tax increases or significant spending cuts in the budget. I mean, the budget is, we always said that the budget on the 31st of October last year, in a sense, was day one of the new Labour government because it was going to chart a course for the remainder of the Parliament. Well, I think the second budget that she will deliver in October of this year will be the budget which actually demonstrates that Labour's election strategy, whilst on the one hand sound for getting them through an election, made a number of pledges which were just plain silly given the state of the public finances. And it's probably at the budget this year that Labour manifesto will be binned and will go up in flames. Where might she go in terms of increases in tax? Well, you will recall in the budget on the 31st of October last year, the Conservatives had planned to freeze the personal allowance, I think, all the way to 2029. She said, no, Labour won't go with that they will restore inflationary increases to the personal allowance from 2028. Well, the easiest thing to do, rather than announce an increase in direct taxation, would be to extend that policy, to go back on the announcement which she made last October and to extend it perhaps to 2030. If she did that, that would give her an extra £10 billion. But given the scale of the challenge, the no tax rises for working people, I simply do not see how that is going to survive the entirety of this Parliament. And the IFS, I think, are pretty clear that it's probably going to be tax increases sooner rather than later. And the other thing, of course, is that, and I think you're quite right to talk through the sense in which that this has been a difficult one for Labour to manage. And I do agree that they've completely and utterly lost control of the narrative here. We're now beginning to get significant murmurings on the backbenches. I think we're at sort of 24 Labour MPs who are not going to support these measures when they come before.
And
before the House of Commons.
yeah, and I think that figure is likely to rise to what, 40, 50 at least. And you speak to former ministers, and they say, well, look, when the OBR comes back to you and says your welfare reforms are going to put 250,000 people into relative poverty, we're a Labour Party. You say, well, we're not going to do that.
The problem in welfare, really, in a sense, is quite a simple one. If the government had said that we want to reform welfare, and the number one object of the exercise is to take people from welfare and put them into work, that's the first objective of the policy. And if the consequence of that is that we save significant amounts of money, then that's a good thing. It's a win-win situation. But of course, what is driving welfare reforms is simply the need to save money. And therefore, what's happened is that they've got the conclusion, which is the saving of money, and then they work back the way, rather than have a well worked out plan to get people from welfare into work. I mean, that line, 250,000 people, 250,000, being pushed into poverty, 50,000 of them children. Despite the fact there may well be some Labour MPs who have some sympathy with elements of the welfare reform package, when it actually gets to families who are not in great circumstances, relative to the rest of society, they're not in great circumstances, to intentionally, as a consequence of a policy decision to make them poorer, is simply something that Labour MPs will not wear. And I think you're right. I think when we get to the final vote, I would be amazed if we were not looking at a rebellion of 50 plus.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the other thing, though, I think it probably does bear pointing out and so on about welfare reform, and I absolutely agree with you that they have got the messaging wrong on this as well. That it needs to be presented as the Labour Party is the party of working people, which is not a party of welfare. We exist to get people into work, to lead fulfilling lives and have a much more dignified existence, etc., etc., etc. The dignity of labour. That is the Labour Party's historic purpose in many respects, and so emphasizing the improving people's lives through work aspect of welfare reform is a much more palatable way of presenting it, and a much more reasonable way of presenting it too, than this, if you like, sort of budget-based approach that we've seen. At the same time, I think it ought to be acknowledged that if you ask the electorate where they would like to see the government make savings, if savings have to be made, then the top answer is always overseas aid, international aid. And the second answer, the second most popular answer, is always welfare. So the political cost, while significant within the Labour movement of cutting welfare and so on, may not actually have quite the same impact amongst the general public as a whole. But clearly it is going to be very, very difficult for very important and long-standing Labour constituencies within the electorate. But, for instance, it's an immensely complicated business, but the Resolution Foundation, left of centre think tank, came out with an analysis where they said that, they noted that 2/3 of the welfare cuts will fall on people below average incomes, thereby pushing many people into relative poverty, which is defined as an income of 60% of average earnings. And that's a big, scary number, of course. But the implication of that, obviously, as well, is that 1/3 of these welfare cuts will actually fall on people or families on above average earnings. And I suspect that the ordinary member of the public, the median voter, is going to look at that and think, well, that's all right, because people on above average earnings shouldn't be receiving any kind of welfare payments at all. I don't say that in a disparaging sense and so on. I just say that that's where I think a lot of the average voter is going to be on these things, which is why welfare cuts, however difficult and sometimes very appalling and unfair, perhaps, on individuals, but welfare cuts collectively may not damage the Labour government with the electorate as a whole to the extent that people within the Labour movement think it will.
Yeah. On the growth issue, they've lost control of the narrative, and I think that's a very, very serious issue for a government that says that growth is right at the heart of what it does. On the welfare reforms, there is dissent within the Parliamentary Labour Party. I think at the level of individual Labour Party members, there is a sense of dismay. And of course, what sometimes makes the sell on these issues all the more difficult is that they are pushing 250,000 people into poverty, whilst at the same time finding substantial amounts of money for defence. And we'll recall that one of the first decisions that Rachel Reeves took as Chancellor was to deal with the winter fuel payments. Cost to the Exchequer, £1.5 billion. We can't afford £1.5 billion. But hey, presto, if circumstances and the political will is there, and you can debate the merits of the defence spending or not, governments will find the money if they need to find the money and if there is a political will. I think with this government, time after time after time, it's the mismanagement of the message which really gets them into trouble. So there are problems with the backbenches. I think there's a demoralisation within the Labour Party in the country at the way in which things are headed. And between now and the end of this Parliament, there is an almighty clash coming with the paymasters. With individual trade unions over this 15% reduction in civil service jobs. Now, despite the fact this is a pretty key announcement, it was in all of the papers last week, so it was clearly briefed. Then the Chancellor confirmed in a series of interviews on Sunday that they were going to go ahead with this. There is a voluntary scheme for civil servants, which has been voluntary redundancy scheme, which has been launched. I don't think there is any sense in which they will get the numbers that they're looking for. If you're a civil servant and you're in your 50s and you can see a final salary pension scheme on the horizon, you may well be tempted by voluntary redundancy. But if you're a long way from retirement, I suspect that there will be no incentive to go whatsoever, because as we've discussed before, these public sector pensions are significant from the point of view of workers. If you leave that environment in your 30s or your 40s and you take voluntary redundancy and you come out of a final salary pension scheme, you ain't going back in to a final salary pension scheme, because by and large they do not exist any longer. They certainly don't exist in terms of new members in the private sector. And even with some public sector schemes, if you go into a different job, you'll find that the rules of the scheme have greatly changed to reflect the fact that most of these are not fully funded. And in fact, the taxpayer just pick up the bill for these. So I think that there's an almighty row coming with the trade unions on this, and I can see trouble ahead with the backbenches on welfare, trouble ahead at the party conference in terms of people saying, with these reforms, we will not put up, trouble with the public sector trade unions, and all of that might be manageable if growth was happening, but it's not happening like anything near enough.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other problem is that we pay £100 billion a year on debt interest payments, which is a consequence of a successive number of shocks to the British economy, starting in 2008, then Brexit, then COVID, support for energy bills, etc., etc., etc. And it's that 100 billion that really complicates absolutely everything else for the Chancellor. And without economic growth, then reducing the share of government expenditure on debt interest payments is going to be very, very difficult. But perhaps we should consider some of the politics of this as well, particularly in a Scottish context, Bernard, because it seems to me that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer at south of the border, the Conservative Party remains in disarray. Yes, the government is not very popular. We have had a number of polls this week showing essentially a three-way tie between Labour, Conservatives and Reform. But from Starmer's point of view, he doesn't have to face the electorate until 2028 or 2029. so he has time for things to work through the system. And he needn't, I think, be terribly concerned by the opinion polls just now. That is not the case for Labour in Scotland, of course, who face an election next year. And the way in which events of the last few weeks have unfolded and so on could hardly have been better designed from the SNP's point of view. It seems to be that welfare cuts, other measures in the budget, the government's unpopularity, the lack of economic growth, all of which may allow the SNP to craft a message before next May's Holyrood elections that says, look, you don't have to be particularly impressed by everything the SNP has done, but you can be sure of this. You know this about us. We stand up for Scotland. We put the Scottish national interest first. We do what we can to protect Scotland against whatever party happens to be in government in the House of Commons, whether it's a Conservative government or a Labour government. Only the SNP can be trusted to stand up for Scotland. Look, here's the Labour Party betraying its own history, its own principles, putting people into poverty, blah, 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 blah. That is a really easy and to a certain extent, I will acknowledge, compelling argument for the SNP to make. And I think it is going to be quite difficult for Anas Sarwar and the Scottish Labour Party to counter that as matters are just now.
Yes, I agree with that. And what's been actually striking is that in some of the policy announcements early on in the lifetime of the Labour government, Anas Sarwar has said, no, we're going to go our own way in Scotland. We won't do it the way the Labour government at Westminster is proposing, these so-called mitigations to UK policy. But of course, his problem there is that John Swinney has already decided to mitigate on key areas, leaving Anas Sarwar, A, with no credible policy, but B, simply putting too much space between him and the Prime Minister, because if he keeps opposing everything that the UK Labour government does, the SNP not unreasonably are going to say, well, why would you want to vote for this man when he doesn't agree with terribly much that the party are doing south of the border? I think it's quite interesting, actually. I almost wonder if he's been. Well, I know he does listen to the podcast. I know that he does listen to.
Hello, Anas. Do write in.
I know he does listen to the podcast because we've made the point. Look, you can attack certain things that the UK Labour government have done. That's a perfectly respectable point of view to take. But if you're the leader of the Scottish Labour Party and you just keep opposing things, you're going to put yourself into a horrible situation in an election campaign. And it's quite interesting in relation to what I would call, in a sliding scale of what would people within the Labour family find most offensive? Is it the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance for pensioners? Is it the two-child policy? Is it the cuts to welfare? I would suggest it's the cuts to welfare, because there are going to be rather a lot of people, 800,000, who are going to just see their benefits cut there and then. And yet he's backed those. He's backed those because I think he realizes that he'll be in an impossible position if he simply attacks everything that the UK government are doing. It's a horrible situation from his point of view. The only thing that he can do at the election is to fight the election on the SNP's record in government and try and get people to focus on that, just as John Swinney is going to fight the election on Labour's record at a UK level and doing things which he thinks are positively harmful and wrong. A couple of by-elections in Glasgow a week ago, both were Labour-held seats, one in the northeast of the city, one in the south side of the city. Both were Labour-held seats, and Labour lost both of them to the SNP. The numbers in the northeast, it wasn't a resounding triumph for the SNP, but it was a victory, and it was a victory which they gained at the expense of Labour, and a very, very high vote indeed for Reform UK, who beat the Conservatives in that northeast seat. Now, the turnouts were absolutely abysmal, and we shouldn't read too much into local government by-elections. They're the least accurate barometer of what's going to happen when actual votes take place. But of course, we'll be having a by-election for the Scottish Parliament in the coming months, and that will be a real test of opinion. By-elections for the Scottish Parliament do not happen as often as by-elections for Westminster, and all of a sudden, because of the state of ferment in electoral politics since the general election last year, that could tell us quite a lot.
Yes, absolutely, and of course the reason there'll be a by-election obviously is the death of Christina McKelvey, the SNP government minister, long-standing SNP MSP, who died from secondary breast cancer. And it was very striking, actually. In Holyrood on Thursday of this week, and so on, the emotion in the chamber. I think plenty of MSPs essentially close to tears when thinking about Christina McKelvey and her record and her character. And it was a reminder, I suppose, that there are only 129 members of the Scottish Parliament. It is a very small institution, and in certain respects, despite their political differences, an MSP from one party has more in common with an MSP from another party than they do with people out with the Parliament. And it is, in that sense, a kind of family or a clan. And I think that, her death has had a profound and deep impact on many people, not most especially within the SNP, of course, but not solely within the SNP. And so that will be a highly charged by-election, which will, as you say, tell us something a bit more about the current mood of the electorate. To what extent are people voting as a kind of protest against Keir Starmer's government, and to what extent are they voting as a kind of protest against John Swinney's government? And I think you're right to suggest that there will essentially be two elections next year. One will be a referendum on Labour at a UK level, and the other will be a referendum on the SNP at a Scottish level. And so the outcome of the election next year will essentially be determined by how many people take part in each of these unofficial referendums. And so if more people are voting because of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, and because they don't like what they're doing, then that's good news for John Swinney and the SNP. Conversely, if the Labour argument and that it is time for a change after 2 decades of SNP rule in Edinburgh, if that proves the decisive or most popular argument in the election, then that will be bad news for the SNP. And it's at the moment just too early to say exactly which of these arguments is going to prevail and dominate the campaign. But the terms of engagement for the campaign, it seems to me, are fairly clear at this point. The other difficulty I would suggest to you about it, and interested to get your thoughts on this and so on, is that there's a mood within the Labour Party, I think, no good deed goes unpunished. And so they take the view that, look, the budget in October actually sent an enormous amount of extra money north to Scotland. Barnett consequentials and other funding streams and so on meant that, it was a multi-billion-pound uplift in the funding available to the Scottish government. Is then obviously up to John Swinney and Kate Forbes and Shona Robertson to determine how that money is spent. But there is plenty of Labour politicians who are acutely aware of the irony that to the extent the Scottish budget is protected, or the Scottish government has room for manoeuvre, it is largely as a result of increases to its funding mandated by the Labour government in London. And so, I had a senior Labour figure said to me the other day, look, we have provided them with a whole load of spades, to get Scotland building again and so on, and they have taken the spades and said, thank you very much, and then start hitting us around the head with them. And that is sort of something that is baked into the architecture of devolution, of course. But it is a problem for whoever happens to be in power at Westminster, and an advantage for whoever happens to be in power at Holyrood. And that advantage is multiplied if they are of different parties.
Yeah, and Barnett consequentials are a double-edged sword, rather conveniently because Rachel Reeves decided to front-load public expenditure, particularly on health, in year one, I mean, public expenditure will grow for all of the Parliament, but the biggest real terms increases came in year one, which provided a lot of largesse for the SNP government to, frankly, to bail them out of a hole of their own making, because as the Auditor General had pointed out, that they were funding pay awards, signing off on pay awards without knowing where the money was coming from. So they were, if nothing had changed and there was no new money, you would have been looking at some really aggressive cuts to spending in Scotland over the course of the last year, which did not take place as a consequence of the Barnett consequentials flowing from Rachel Reeves's first budget. But of course, on these welfare issues, where there are going to be cuts, the Scottish government have an issue here, because the instinct always with the Scottish government is that if something is done in Westminster which they don't like, they will attempt to mitigate the policy. They will attempt to restore people into the position that they would have been in if cuts from Westminster hadn't taken place. Now, I haven't seen what the final cut will be that will flow to the Scottish bloc as a result of these welfare payments. But my instincts tell me that the cut will be too big to mitigate, and that the SNP will not be able to say to people in Scotland, look, it doesn't matter what they're doing down south. You'll be no worse off, because we will make sure that you'll be no worse off. I think the extent of the cut, the consequentials, and this is what I mean, it's a double-edged sword. If health spending keeps going up in England, then there's consequences that the bloc will get bigger. But the other thing is that if things are cut, then the double-edged sword means that your block grant is going to be cut. And I don't think there will be any mitigations, or if there are mitigations in welfare, they'll be strictly limited, in my view.
Well, because welfare spending is already taking up an increasing proportion of the Scottish Government's budget because of a more generous and looser system of welfare assessment north of the border. The other irony I would suggest, Barnett and Zod, is that if the SNP were to get what they want, or what they say they want, within our current constitutional circumstances, of course, the SNP's preference is for independence. But if they were to get what they want within the current constitutional setup, then it would be the SNP imposing an extraordinary degree of austerity on Scotland, a combination of tax increases and spending cuts that collectively would have to amount to around between 10 and 12 billion pounds a year. This is because the SNP have resurrected, rather quietly and without any great public fanfare, their policy of full fiscal autonomy. This emerged from a letter, a submission to the Scottish Affairs Select Committee in the House of Commons, which is investigating the mechanism of devolution funding the Scottish Government and Parliament, in which Shona Robeson, the Finance Secretary, wrote to the committee outlining the Scottish Government's preferred position, which is for full fiscal autonomy, which is something we haven't heard from the SNP for quite some time, not really since the Smith Commission report set up in the aftermath of the independence referendum more than a decade ago. Full fiscal autonomy, just as a quick catch-up for listeners who may have quite sensibly forgotten about it, is essentially that Scotland would be responsible for raising all taxes within Scotland, onshore and offshore, would have the receipts from that taxation, would then send a cheque south to cover items of Scottish share of reserved expenditure on things such as defence, foreign policy, security policy, and so on. But essentially, it would be a kind of independence within the UK, which was quite attractive in a couple of years before the independence referendum, when Scotland was in surplus, at least according to the official figures. It is rather less attractive in a situation where public spending by both governments in Scotland is, according to the most recent Scottish Government figures, £22 billion a year more than the amount of taxation raised in Scotland. So closing that gap, I think, would be extraordinarily challenging in a full fiscal autonomy setup. And it is mystifying to me why the SNP has resurrected this cause. because and it strikes me as this is a gift to Labour if Labour is astute and nimble enough to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I mean the issue of fiscal autonomy, one will recall, in the dying days of the independence referendum, we had the famous vow, the pledge from the leaders of the unionist parties that you can vote no in the referendum, and that will mean that more powers will flow north. Now, of course, we had the Smith Commission, which poured over all of these issues. The SNP's formal submission to the Smith Commission was one for fiscal autonomy. Actually, this policy used to be the policy many years ago of the old Scottish Liberal Party. It was back then called assigned revenues. We will assign revenues to Scotland, as you've described it. Good or bad? Well, clearly, if you were moving to a position of fiscal autonomy when the economy was booming and receipts were at record levels, it's a good model. And if you're in pretty austere circumstances where there's very little or no fiscal headroom and a huge deficit, it's not a very, very good idea. I think it would be wrong to look at this particular policy through the prism of, is this a good year? Is that a bad year? The issue is, what are the merits of it? The merits of it, as I can see, and I think that you're right, and I've said this over the years to Labour figures, that one of the problems actually for unionists at Westminster is that the block grant, and in terms of identifiable public expenditure per head being higher in Scotland, it allows the Scottish Government to do things which the government south of the border cannot do. And then if something happens which the government in Scotland do not like, they then point an accusatory finger at politicians in London and say, tut, tut, tut. Now, this sort of politics of grievance, I think in part would recede if you were having a position of assigned revenues. The difficulty with it would be this. If you are moving towards this system where effectively the Barnett formula is scrapped, it's no longer needed. So it's no longer a formula which is population based, and in a sense, it doesn't bake in these increases in public expenditure, which are higher in Scotland than they are in England. In the early years, if you sort of simply move from a Barnett formula, which historically Scotland has done extremely well from, to a position of assigned revenues, you could be cutting off your nose to spite your face. But I do think, and have always thought, that as a general model and as a general principle, assigned revenues, fiscal autonomy, call it what you will, in terms of accountability and raising money, is actually pretty sound. But in politics, you should, be careful what you wish for.
Absolutely, it works very well in theory, but in practice, it would be extremely difficult for Scotland because the current situation is that Scotland is essentially 8% of the UK population, but it receives 9% of public spending in Scotland, in the UK. So it would do astonishingly well out of Barnett. I mean, Barnett is unjustifiable, I would say. It should have been scrapped years ago. Barnett is a formula that is nearly 50 years old and is itself just an update of the Goshen formula that was introduced in 1888. By the then Chancellor, who was, seeking a mechanism for dividing up funding between England, Scotland, Wales, Northern and Ireland at the time, so we've had one revision to a funding formula in the thick end of 150 years, and it isn't needs based, as you say, it's population based, and Scotland is actually a comparatively wealthy part of the United Kingdom. It's not as wealthy as London, obviously, not as wealthy as the southeast of England, but on a par with the east of England, and Scotland. They're always in a sort of tussle to see which is the third wealthiest part of the UK. And Scotland is funded as though it was a poor part of the UK. So there is a sort of self-reliance and indeed a conservative argument for fiscal autonomy. but it is not one that can be embraced without accepting that at the moment, when Scotland's notional deficit is 10% of GDP, twice that of the UK as a whole, you cannot embrace fiscal autonomy without accepting that it would require, as an immediate thing, huge tax increases and huge spending cuts, because Scotland's deficit and so on is actually greater than the total amount of income tax raised in Scotland.
Well, we'll no doubt come back to this. I mean, you're on the Barnett formula. I seem to recall the House of Lords, House of Lords committee several years ago recommended scrapping the formula specifically because it was not needs based. And if you were divvying up money to the nations and regions of the United Kingdom on the basis of need, then less would be flowing north, and people in the northeast of England in particular would find a greater skewing of public expenditure to their region, because in relative terms it has greater need.
And to Wales as well, Barnett. Yeah. Not that anyone is that interested by Wales and so on, but Wales has been sort of screwed by Barnett for decades.
All the way back to Michael Forsyth being Secretary of State for Scotland, debates about the demise of the Barnett formula. The interesting thing about financials in terms of the relationship between the nations of the UK, there's always lots of noise, there's always lots of debate, and historically, as you've pointed out, there is very, very little change. But perhaps we could come back to this in a future episode, and indeed have one or two guests on to talk about it. But we've had a good run this morning. I don't know what it's like in Edinburgh and Glasgow. It looks a nice, bright, crisp day, and I'm going out for a little wander and walk in the park. About time I did some exercise. What does the day hold for you, dear boy?
Well, I'm off to Edinburgh Airport. I'm going over to Dublin for a memorial service for an old university friend who sadly died last year, but it promises to be a rather splendid occasion this evening. We should be at Trinity College, and then I imagine we'll be in the Stag's Head until such time as the Stag's Head owners decide our presence is no longer acceptable.
Well, it's one of the iconic bars, as you know, in Dublin, and I don't go anywhere near the Temple Bar. I saw some online drinks receipts the other week that your pint of Guinness in the Temple Bar is now at €10.50.
Yes. Well, that's the tourists for you, isn't it?
Well, look, you enjoy your time in Dublin, and no doubt over the course of the weekend at some point I will be doing as you are doing in Dublin. But for the moment, from this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast, from me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.